Hope everyone's having a terrific day and a good spring of bass fishing so far. And, usually this is about the fourth or fifth one of these seminars that I've done. And typically when I put something together, it's a seasonal type topic that, you guys can take out in the water and go fish almost immediately. And this may be the kind of the closest one that I've ever done when some weather change hasn't happened, or it's gotten too warm too quick, it's cooled down too fast, or things don't kind of coincide. So a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about, some of these overlooked tactics and patterns for bass that you can go out right now, and some of you guys that live in the northern climates that are still frozen, you'll have to wait a little bit. But I was actually out in the water. I've been traveling quite a bit away from home, and I live in East Tennessee, and was out in the water today a little bit, just looking around, and several of these things that I'm going to talk about are happening right now. So this is kind of a little bit of a different topic for me too. Typically I do more pattern specific things, and this is kind of a cool deal because these are some overlooked things that guys don't necessarily think of when they're on the water. And I'm telling you that you'll realize how many times you probably drive by a variety of these different things and never even give it a second thought of fishing or afterthought of, man, I should have gone and done that. So, excuse me, I'm kind of making a habit of looking at and trying to exploit any of these patterns and tactics anytime I'm out in the water, anytime I'm where any of these things exist. I'm going to at least give it a try. And it may not be the kind of thing where it's going to work every single time, but it may be the thing where it's really going to pay off if you give it a try. So overlooked patterns versus tactics. And basically, from what I put together, a pattern is specific to cover, and tactic is specific to the lure. So, the particular pattern that we're on is, a certain thing. And then, okay, the tactic is what kind of bait are we going to throw? So we're going to look at both of those things, and both will be very, very specific as far as how I go about breaking this down. And it's important to realize too, that not all fish do the same thing. They're not always on the same pattern. They don't always do the same, thing continuous of, all throughout the year. So, right now in East Tennessee, we're dealing with, I would say, still pre-spawn. I don't even think that, a wave of fish has even moved up to spawn yet. The water temperature's been hovering about 50, 52 degrees. We've had a couple of days where, things have warmed up a little bit to 58, and then you get a cold front and it moves everything back. And the same thing with, a lot of places around the country, even Florida, where I've had a chance to go fish in the last, month or so, is that, it starts to warm up a little bit, and then we get a weather change and it kind of knocks it back. So we're just getting underway, even though it's the end of March, there's still a ton of really good pre-spawn, spawn, post-spawn fishing coming up. But realize that all fish don't do the same pattern. So there may be fish that, live their entire lives in shallow, areas, resident fish that just, don't even know that the outside lake exists. On the other hand, I'm really convinced that there's some fish that just live deep. They stay deep, they live deep, they spawn deeper, and that's where they live. Unique overlooked patterns are also a great way to target what others miss. And think back, and you'll start to realize as we go along here, think about how many times you might have driven by one of these things and not even thought to make a cast or fish by it, and not given it a second thought. Really small areas, really precise little patterns and precise tactics to catch those fish. The good thing about these types of overlooked patterns is that they're typically, you have them all to yourself. If others are going to miss them, the majority of the field is, or people that are out there in the lake are, maybe looking to something that's very obvious, and you're looking to something that's, totally opposite. So that's a cool thing, that you'll have this stuff to yourself quite often. And every overlooked pattern has a specific tactic. Not maybe the only way to catch fish, but I try to keep things extremely simple when I'm out there fishing. I don't try to overcomplicate things a whole lot. And for me, really, overlooked patterns and tactics it's all about reaction baits. And there's many different types of patterns. The cool thing about this is that if you only have a certain time during maybe the month or the week or a couple of weeks where you get to go out and fish, and you don't have a lot of experience on that lake, or you're not sure what those fish have done over the last couple of weeks, and you want to go pattern some fish pretty quick, these are really easy ways that you can eliminate a lot of water really quick and also be able to pattern these fish quickly and be able to pick the right bait. So it's a great thing that, especially for me, where, my job is to go catch as many fish as I can, whether it's a tournament or, whatever. I'm trying to catch as many fish as I can in the quickest amount of time. If you only have one day a month to go fish, you don't want to spend the entire day looking around for fish. You want to be able to go and get on some patterns and catch some fish pretty quick. So it's really great in being able to eliminate some water and be able to get on a pattern really quickly. So we're going to talk about several things here. We're going to talk about some of my favorite overlooked patterns, ditches and drains, which I've got some pictures that I actually shot today of some of that stuff, boat ramps, flats, and then shad spawn and bluegill spawn, which are, depending upon where you live, the shad spawn may be relevant and it may not be, but definitely bluegill spawn will be relevant to everybody that's listening in. So those are my favorites. And obviously there's probably some more too, but these are the things that I find that I come back to more often. There's another one too that I did not put in here just because more people stop to maybe fish these than not, and that's a bridge. And there's probably not a lake that I go fish that I don't throw something at a bridge, whether it's a swim bait or a crankbait, or maybe dragging a jig along if it's shallow enough. I don't think there's a lake that I've ever gone on where I haven't at least tried to go fish a bridge. So that's another really good pattern, not one we're going to talk about tonight, but one that I think a lot of guys fish more than these other ones. So let's take a look at a couple of considerations. And the first thing is that I always start with some sort of a reaction bait. And typically I kind of break that down to a few. I've got a few that I really like to fish. We're talking pretty shallow water stuff here for the most part. And it's always around some type of specific type of cover. And you'll notice with, ditches and boat ramps and that sort of thing that, it's very, very specific to a very specific area. And this is what I mean about being able to get to this really quick, is that you can pull up to an area or a spot and, make 4 or 5 casts and be able to tell if the pattern's going to work in that particular area or if you need to go ahead and move. It's a very, very fast moving deal when you get on any of these. And always remember too that, there's other ways to catch fish besides, what I'm showing you. I'm going to show you, what I do to catch them quick, but, what happens when you want to come back and catch a few more? There's an old saying that, 90% of the fish live in 10% of the lake. And that is so true a lot of times, that they get real specific to a type of cover or an area, and they're in a real small confined zone, and they're not, a half a mile down one way and a half mile down the other. They're right here on this spot. And just because you catch a few fish does not mean that you've caught every single one that lives there. A lot of times these spots will replenish. A lot of times these places will have more than one fish in it too. But the thing that I've learned over the years is when you catch a few, they get really wise to the type of bait you're throwing, the type of retrieve that you're making. And they get used to that very, very quick. You'd be surprised how many 2 or 3 fish from one area will all of a sudden shut the entire, group of fish off. And you'll have to try other things. Typically what I'll do is I'll change different retrieves first. If I'm throwing, a reaction bait, I'll stop and go, slow it down, speed it up, do different things. If there's some cover involved too, maybe I'll try to trigger a fish and bounce off the cover. Deflection is a great way to trigger strikes. And if I can catch a few more that way, that's great. But sometimes I've got to do the total opposite, slow down a little bit and maybe throw a jig or a worm or some kind of plastic or a shaky worm to try to catch a few more fish. So always have that in your back pocket too when you want to maximize your time in the water instead of running all around looking for more places. You can come back and slow down and catch a few fish. So let's take a look at the very first one. I shot this picture actually today, and I live on a lake in East Tennessee called Douglas Lake, and it is pretty typical of most of the southern type impoundments with the respect that there's a drawdown. So in the wintertime, that lake is down 50 feet, and then in the springtime it comes up 50 feet. So that's the fluctuation. A little bit extreme for most of your lakes, but a lot of the lakes here in East Tennessee and all throughout the South and in other areas, they have a winter pool and a summer pool. And it may only fluctuate a few feet, or it may fluctuate 10 or 20, or it may fluctuate 50 in my case. The cool thing about this lake going up and down the way it does is it really shows a lot of terrain, a lot of cover, a lot of areas where bass will hold it. And right now the water's coming up. It's not coming up terribly fast, maybe 4 or 5 inches a day. And you'll notice that on this picture, there's some trash floating around. That's, typical when the lake comes up. There'll be some debris and trash floating down the lake. But what I want you to look at is look in the background and look at where those 2 mounds kind of come together right about there. And that is what I would consider a ditch. It's two land masses that kind of form this little ditch in the center. And that's a classic place to go look at, to find some fish. And ditches and drains are similar, but a little bit different as well. And they're great migration routes for pre-spawn bass, which is what's going on here right now. Those fish will use those ditches and drains to ambush prey, stage up. If they're back in flats, they like those areas too, where they've got a little bit of depth change to be able to sit down in a little bit of hole or something like that, and then they can move up on these flats to eventually spawn. So in the springtime, both ditches and drains are great places to go find some fish, and some are quite shallow and others are quite deep. This particular one here was about 10 foot deep, and then it's about 6 foot up on the sides. So pretty good ditch for looking to find some pre-spawn spring bass. Easy to find on drawdown lakes. You just drive around the bank, and I don't know how many there are up and down this particular bank. This bank is about 5 miles long, and there's just continuous little ditches. And the other thing too is that it's a great fall pattern. I like it really in the springtime pre-spawn, and then again in the fall. And that's probably due to the water fluctuating. It's much better, these main lake kind of ditches when the water fluctuates. But especially springtime is a great time to go find these ditches and drains. And subtle breaks and changes and depth changes, like I said. I was on another one. In fact, this next slide will be a different one that I drove over, more comprehensive of what I classify as a drain, much shallower, 1 foot to about a 2 foot drop. And if you also got some alternate cover, say there's some rock or some wood or brush or anything like that that's submerged in around that, it's even a plus, because that's more things for those fish to get around. And that's that pattern within a pattern that I speak about in a lot of my seminars. Yeah, I'm catching around a ditch or a drain, but it's the ones that have maybe a rock component or a brush component or logs or stumps or something like that. Just something else to hold those fish. Fish like things that are really different a lot of times. And one subtle little tiny change between one structure and another can make a huge difference in being able to find some fish or not. So always, look for that alternative cover too, or that pattern within a pattern to really key you in on what those fish are located on.
Mike, excuse me 1 second. Someone had typed in that there's some music playing in the background. I don't have anything on here at the house. I don't know if you do.
I don't either.
Okay. I don't know how it's coming in then. All right. Sorry.
Yeah. I'm not sure where that's come from. I've got everything turned off here at the house, but there's both shots. I zoomed in a little closer on that top picture, which is what I classify as a ditch. And then the bottom one, look at how subtle that little tiny piece of cover is. That's what I kind of consider a drain. And drains I typically find on more flatter areas, the backs of coves, backs of little pockets, creeks, little flat banks that have just a tiny little vein or a tiny little drain associated with. And you'll see that it's right there. That is a lot more subtle than this right here. That's the kind of deal, you can catch some fish there, but some people will stop and maybe look at those. Not too many people will stop and look at some of this stuff. And it's really easy to find a lot of times. And one of the tools that I use, consistently when I'm out there either idling around or before I get to the lake and want to go put my boat in to go fish is having that navionics chart in my sonar units. So it is probably the biggest tool that I have in being able to locate stuff. And you can just simply go around. Now, this is Douglas Lake at full pool, but if you think about taking 50 foot of water out of this particular area right here, all of these little pockets are going to form these types of drains. And the shallower flats are going to have these little drains right here. So these are going to be what I'd consider the ditches, or some of these smaller pockets will be what's left of the ditch when the water comes out. And then on these flats right here, you'll see the drains. So pretty easy to go find that sort of stuff. But having this navionics chip in my sonar really, really helps me save a lot of time and really pinpoint the areas that I want to go and fish. So recognize both of those, that they're both really cool places to go catch some fish, and something that a lot of people just overlook and don't even think of making a cast to. So I'm going to talk about baits here in a minute, because both of the baits that I fish on ditches, drains, also relate to boat ramps too. And this is a really cool deal. And I've noticed that at least a lot of places that I fish down here in the Southeast, a lot of people build or have ramps at their house where they can put their pontoon boat in, put their john boat in, put their bass boat in, and go fish. And they're just concrete ramps that somebody has poured on their property. They can go and put their boat in. I've actually got one in the development that I live. It's not at my house, but it's just down the street. But 3 or 4 of my neighbors have boat ramps on their property. And a lot of people just overlook that and just drive right on by. They're so focused in on maybe go, running into the back of the creek or the back of a pocket or somewhere else that, they blast right by areas like these ditches and drains and especially boat ramps too, and don't even make a cast at it. It's one of the, probably, as far as I'm concerned, one of the most overlooked forms of cover that you can actually fish. And they're good all throughout the year. It doesn't matter if it's spring, summer, fall, even into the wintertime. I like it especially in the springtime because that water's moving a little bit. There's a little bit of current. There's a little bit of current break, and maybe that's why ditches and drains are so good too, is because that little bit of current break is enough to wash some food over and give those fish, places to hide and ambush, and it just makes perfect places for them to set up. And boat ramps are no different. If you look at this particular boat ramp right here, it's fairly soft bottom. I know there's some rock over there and there's some gravelly stuff over here, but this is a fairly kind of muddy bottom and kind of some rubble on both ends of the boat ramp where they, build it up to pour the ramp. And that's a great ambush point on both sides, depending upon what way the current's going, for those fish to get in there, hold up, and ambush prey. And it presents also some hard cover for them to get on. And the ones that I really like are the ones that are on really flat, nothing looking banks that all of a sudden have maybe 3 or 4, boat ramps in a row. And the reason I like that is because those banks do not attract a lot of attention. They're really featureless, not a lot of cover, flat, ugly banks. But when you pull up there upon closer inspection, you'll see some boat ramps, great place, individual targets for those bass to hide. And that's the stuff that I really like to go find because others are just going to go right on by. Best boat ramps are around softer banks too. If you can find, just like I said, some of those real soft, sandy, kind of muddy clay banks, and all of a sudden there's a boat ramp there, awesome place to go find a fish because it's something that's different. If you think about other types of covers or structures, isolation. Big fish like isolation quite a bit. One tree, one bush, one boat dock, one rock pile, one isolated brush pile, one standing tree, but whatever it is, one. And isolation is a great way to go find a big fish. And it's a really, really good way to catch a big fish is on these types of boat ramps too. And it's also a quick pattern to fish. Ditches, drains, and boat ramps are really, really fast things. And that's the reason I like them. I can pull up to them, make 4 or 5 casts, go to the next one. Make 4 or 5 casts, go to the next one. It's not like I have to sit there and try to really figure out how to catch some fish. I'm throwing reaction baits. They're going to be there or they're not. If I get a few bites, that's great. Now I can slow down a little bit. If I don't get any bites, I can go ahead and move to the next one. So these patterns, all 3 of these types of covers and structures are extremely fast, extremely quick ways to catch them, and ones that I really like to exploit in the springtime. So here's what I like to throw. This is pretty much my springtime lineup. It's a chatterbait and a square bill. It's pretty much it. Tie them both on and go fish. I don't like one over the other. I like them both. Both react really, really well to both of these types of structures. I will usually throw the chatterbait first, and I fish a 3/8 ounce white or a green pumpkin chatterbait, either one. And I take I use a little bit different trailer with my chatterbait versus a paddle tail or a curly tail or that split tail that used to come packaged with it. I like there's a bait from Yamamoto. It's called a shed shaped worm. And it is a drop shot bait. For any of you guys who have ever drop shot fished with one of those baits, it is a awesome chatterbait trailer. It doesn't look like a whole lot until you actually put it on and go fish with it. But simply thread it on the back of your chatterbait. Sometimes I like contrasting colors. Sometimes I'll put a white one on the white chatterbait and kind of this is a 305 colors baby bass on the back of the green pumpkin. I keep it very, very simple, very standard. And chunk it, wind it in. It's really, really simple. The chatterbait is one of the few baits that I don't do a whole lot with as far as different types of retrieves. Sometimes I'll give it a slow pause. If I'm winding, I'll give it 4 or 5 cranks and then just pause it for just a second, let that blade just kind of relax a little bit and then continue my retrieve. And sometimes that's enough to trigger a strike. Other times there's just enough action in that bait that triggers a lot of strikes. It's one of my favorite baits for springtime fish, especially right now. This water's still pretty cold, 50, 52, 53 degrees. Fish are still pretty chilly. And a lot of times this early in the spring, you need to get them to react. And a chatterbait is a great way to get those fish to react. And the other one is a square bill. This is a new Rapala bait, BX Brat. It is well, they make two of them. There's a 3-foot running model and a 6-foot running model. And I'll use them both. Maybe if I'm fishing more of a ditch that's got a little bit more depth, I may throw the 6-foot running model, but I'll throw the 3. If you remember that other slide with the little drain, that was only about 1.5 feet or 2.5 feet of water was max where that was. So I'm going to pick, obviously the right size bait for the right job. And I typically want, when I'm fishing a crankbait, that bait to dive slightly deeper than the water that I'm targeting. So the one thing I found with any of these spots is that they're fairly close to the bank. Very rarely will they be way out off of the bank on this at any type of cover. They're going to be pretty close. So I'm trying to create angles and try to throw not only across the cover, but also down the sides, and try to hit about every single angle that I can. So I maybe use 2 different style crankbaits at 2 different diving depths to achieve that. One up shallow, one out a little bit deeper, and try to create different angles when I'm casting too. Because that's the other thing about triggering fish, is different angles will also trigger fish. If they see the same bait coming by at the same direction each time, they're going to be less likely to bite your bait. You're going to catch a few of the quick ones, easy ones to catch, the aggressive ones, but then they've really got used to seeing your bait come by at the same angle. So if I can change my angle, maybe go to the direct other side of the cover and make a few casts that way, maybe go head on and bring the bait out, from real shallow to a little bit deeper. Just create different angles, show the different angles and presentations, and you'll catch a whole bunch more fish doing that as well. So the next thing is flats. And I think a lot of this is overlooked a lot of times because it's time consuming to fish. If you think about a couple of areas here, this particular backwater flat and this area back here, another pretty big backwater flat. It's a lot in a course of, maybe one day. If you don't have a whole lot of time to go fish, to be able to fish and refine and figure out where the fish live on these structures. It's a whole lot easier to go down the bank and look at a ditch or look at a drain or look at a boat ramp and throw something at it. Those are much quicker patterns. Flats tend to be a little bit more time consuming in finding and locating some fish, but you can still do it fairly quickly. And what I'm typically looking for in a flat is I'm looking for something that's a little bit different. I like flats that are, pretty close proximity to deep water. So there's some deep water nearby. But if you can find one with a little ditch or a drain running through the center of it, even better. So this little ditch or this little drain right here is a great place to be able to target some fish. Same thing with this one over here and that one over there. So all those areas form a little bit different contour. They form a little bit of a drop where those fish can get into, and they give them places where they can hide and ambush prey. So that's going to be kind of the beginning portion of where I look at on a flat. And again, right here too, this could be, a potential drain coming out, especially if the water was let down, if we weren't at full pool, that could be a potential drain. This area could, that area could, and then this big flat area. So these fish are going to use these flats, but they're going to use these, little ditches and drains coming through the flats as migration areas to move around. One of the cool things that I've realized in fishing these flats is there's a really cool pattern, or I should say tactic, for being able to do this. And I got introduced to a bait about 15 years ago. and it's a blade style bait. And this one's in particular called a steel shad. And for those of you who have ever thrown this bait, I'll tell you a quick story first. I was doing seminars in Indianapolis, Indiana at a sports show about 12 or 13 years ago. And in between shows, I walked around, and the guy that owned the company at the time had a little booth there, little 10-foot booth with some steel shads in it. He pulled me over to the side. He asked me if I had ever heard of his bait. And I hadn't. I had fished a Silver Buddy, was the blade style bait that I fished. And I typically fished a 3/4 ounce bait most of the time, and most of the time fished it deep. One of the things I realized about a blade style bait is once you got below 10 or 12 foot of water and even shallower, say 4 or 5 foot, they lose their effectiveness in being able to vibrate down or vibrate up, which is the way that I fish a blade bait. I throw it out, I rip it off the bottom, I let it fall back down. And that's the way I like to fish it. With a Silver Buddy, 3/4 ounce Silver Buddy, you can fish that in deep water. There's enough space or enough water column to get that bait to work up, work down. So I took one of his baits and I went to the bass tank where I was doing seminars, and that tank is 4.5 foot deep. In the first cast I made with the steel shed in that tank, I felt the bait vibrate up and vibrate back down. And I knew from throwing other things in this tank that that was something special. That was something that I'd never really felt while I was blade bait fishing in shallow water. So long story short, I took it back home and I put it through an experiment. This was February back in down here in the South. And I got on some flats, and water was pretty dingy, pretty dirty that day. So I took the red one. This is Red Craw, this color pattern right here, really good pattern for fishing in dingy, dirty water. And just like your crankbaits, red crankbaits are great for dingy, dirty water. So no different than fishing a blade bait. People think you can't fish a blade bait in dirty water. Well, you can. You put a red one on and you'll have really good results with that, as opposed to the traditional silver one, which is great for clear to stained water. And I immediately started to catch some fish. So the cool thing about this particular bait is until a year ago, they only made one size and one weight. It's 3/8 of an ounce. And that's it. They made 5 or 6 different colors. And it was a bait that I didn't keep secret, but I talked about it during seminars, but it's the last year or so, it's really caught on with a lot of guys, and really a bait for me that I like to fish in shallow water. It is the only blade bait that I can rip in 3 to 4 foot of water and get it to react. And the whole key with being able to fish this bait is the cadence at which you rip the bait up. So when I make my cast, I'm ripping the bait up with short pumps of the rod. Now I'm fishing a 7-foot medium action bait casting rod, 7-to-1 retrieve reel, both ducket fishing, and 14-pound test line fluorocarbon. That to me is the best setup for fishing this particular bait. I can feel the bait when I rip the rod up, and then I can also feel the bait. What happens is when I rip the bait up like this, I'm going to slowly lower my rod till I feel that bait hit the bottom. And that's when all the bites come with this particular bait. I rip it up, I feel it vibrate up, I'm letting it fall back down, and that fluorocarbon gives me the sensitivity to be able to feel that bait going back down as well. So that's when all the bites get triggered, is when that bait's falling back down. It's a really, really cool technique. And it's one that not only does it work in shallow water, but I mean, you can fish this bait in virtually any depth that you want. But in my opinion, it excels in shallow water, and it's something that the fish just don't see. You know, they see crankbaits, they see spinnerbaits, chatterbaits, lipless crankbaits. They see all of this stuff all the time, but rarely do they see a blade style bait being ripped in shallow water. So it's just another presentation, and it's a great way to fish those flats because I can fan cast them. I can fish a lot of water in a very short period of time and try to pinpoint this fish to tell me where they're at. And it's a bait. It's another bait, just like the chatterbait, that tends to work extremely well in really cold water. and extremely well too in post-spawn, post-front circumstances too. Bright bluebird skies. Fish don't want to bite very well. You've got to trigger them in a way, and now you're just showing them a bait that they don't get to see too much in a way that they don't get to see it. So give that a try next time you're out on some flats. You want to cover a lot of water. Get your boat positioned either on the flat and throw into the ditch, or down the side of the ditch, or do just the opposite too. You can get in the ditch too and throw out on the flat. I try both things and kind of see where just depends upon where the fish are positioned at that particular day. Sometimes I'll find that the warmer it gets, they'll kind of roam out from those ditches and kind of get in the flat and roam around a little bit. And other times they'll be, especially maybe first thing in the morning, they'll be maybe really oriented towards that little contour break where the ditch is too. So just try some different things, have an open mind, and try that blade bait of that steel shad. It's a great bait to be able to catch some fish with. So here's another really cool thing. And I found this out by mistake a bunch of years ago. And a lot of people think like you cannot catch a topwater fish when it's really cold out. And although my best water temp for doing this is 50 to 52 degrees, the coldest I ever caught a buzzbait fish was 44 degrees. I was fishing a place called Percy Priest Reservoir. I don't know how many, probably 10 years ago. And it was, water temp was 44. The air temp was like 40. It was just a really cold March day. Bluebird skies, not a whole lot of wind. And it was the type of thing where the morning bite that I had was on that red steel shad. And I had caught a few fish doing that. And then that bite died pretty quick. So I went to go fish some other stuff. And typically in the springtime, what I look for is channel swing banks. Banks where the channel swings up against the bank and then turns out and goes to the other side of the lake and creates a pocket or a flat or a point or a cove or something like that on the other side. Great way to be able to eliminate a lot of water fishing those channel swing banks. And I was getting ready to pull up on one, and there was a guy up there up where I wanted to go that was crappie fishing. So I stayed back a little bit and fished another little area just before that channel swing bank. And it was it was a fairly flat bank, had some rock on it. And I noticed that there was some bait fish that were flickering on top of the water. So I always have a buzzbait tied on, regardless of when it is, where it is, what time of year. There's always one in my boat in the box. It may not get fished, but it is always there. So I pulled it out, and I made, on about the third cast, this giant shadow comes up and crushes my buzzbait, and it was an 8-pound, 2-ounce fish. It was wasn't big fish of the tournament, but it was big enough that got me pretty excited about fishing a buzzbait. And I threw it for another couple of hours after that and never caught another fish. So the cool thing about it is that it catches big fish. The other thing about it is that you can get really hung up doing it. So you got to know when to put it down too. But that was the coldest that I ever caught a buzzbait fish. Water was 44 degrees. My best and most consistent water temperature in the springtime is 50 to 52. I like flats, like on that previous screen that we saw with the place where I would fish the steel shad. It's a great place to also fish the buzzbait. Those flat areas, you can cover a lot of water quick with it, but close to deep water. If I can find some type of cover, whether it's lay downs or logs or some kind of trash, some kind of rock, some kind of grass mixed in as well, even better, because that just gives a little bit more element to the type of structure that I'm going to fish. I find that it's not very good early in the morning, as, say summertime fishing with a top water is really, really good first thing in the morning to maybe 10 o'clock, and you can, play the shade to your angle or maybe have some clouds or something like that. And then after that, it gets too hot and it dies down. This particular little deal, I find that it's a little better towards mid-morning throughout the afternoon. Once the water warms up a couple of degrees, the bait fish get a little bit more active. They come up near the surface of the water a lot of times, and get some of those rays of sun to warm up a little bit. And those bass are not far behind. I think that's why this works really good. It is a really, really cool pattern that I've got to work all over the country, no matter where it is. If it's, you know, up north in the springtime or down south. One of the very first places that I ever figured this out was in Alabama, fishing a wintertime tournament in January, and I was probably the only one in the whole field. It was a Bassmaster tournament, fishing a buzzbait in January. And catching them too, spotted bass, largemouth bass, and big fish too. It is a big fish catcher. Sometimes you'll catch numbers, but most of the time you'll only get a few bites, but they'll be really, really big ones. Colors and sizes, I keep it real simple. You know, I fish a quarter ounce buzzbait most of the time, either solid white or solid black. I like both. I like to kind of see which one they're reacting to a little bit better. Sometimes they like the white buzzbait, sometimes they like the black buzzbait. I don't really know or have any type of criteria when I throw one over the other. In the springtime, I'll have them both tied on. Summertime is a little bit different. Getting into that, during the day, I find that they'll eat a black buzzbait a little better than they will the white one. In the morning, they eat the white one a little bit better, but that's summertime stuff. This time of year, I'll have them both on. I'll try them both and see what happens. And pretty standard gear the rest of the time, 7-foot medium heavy action bait casting rod, 7-to-1 gear ratio, reel 2, and then 14-pound test or 17-pound test monofilament. I like my line to stretch a little bit when I'm throwing the buzzbait because you're continuously winding that bait. So having the monofilament that stretches a little bit as opposed to fluorocarbon, which doesn't stretch, gives the fish just a little bit more opportunity to bite my bait, get the bait better, and especially that time of year when a lot of the bites just aren't hugely aggressive. They just kind of come up and just kind of suck it in and not really, smash it like they do in the summertime. Really aggressive strikes. A lot of times the really early season springtime strikes are a lot less violent. So having that little bit of stretch in my line just gives me a little bit better security of being able to hook a fish and keep them hooked up too. And that's about as simple as I make that. It's pretty simple deal. Chunk it out, wind it in, and hang on. Might catch an 8-pound fish. So here's and like I said at the beginning too, this may be something most of you or some of you is the Shad Spawn. The other thing is the Bluegill spawn, which probably pertains to everyone, but Shad Spawn is a really cool deal, and I'll tell you what, it's something that a lot of people miss. And I was actually last year at a tournament when I fished at Ultimate Match Fishing Invitational last year, and I didn't get out as early as I wanted to during practice a couple of those days, and I missed the Shad Spawn. The Shad Spawn happens really early in the morning, first light to about maybe an hour, and that's it, and it's done. And if you're in the wrong area, the wrong place, and you don't see it going on, you can miss it. I actually missed it. I had another tournament in Alabama at Lake Eufaula where I stumbled upon it the first day of the tournament and didn't know what was going on. So it's one of those patterns where it can be red hot in one area, not hot in the other, and happen in an instant. One day it's not happening, the next day it's on fully. So it's a really cool deal, and usually occurs just as some of the fish are finishing or going to post spawn. That's usually my indication that, okay, I want to start maybe looking at it. The other trigger is 70-degree water temperature. When that water hits about 70 degrees and it's 70 in the morning, that's about when the Shad Spawn is really going to start to kick in. And it can be around any type of cover. But in my opinion, some of the best places to go find the Shad Spawn is riprap seawalls and deep boat docks. That's a really cool thing because that's pretty easy to go find that stuff. You can find a Shad Spawn around grass, and in that tournament in Alabama, That's exactly where I found them. They were on grass and lily pads and things like that. But some of the other grass I was fishing in the morning, it wasn't going on. I just happened to stop on a little spot, and it was happening all of a sudden. So I don't know that the grass is as stable as, riprap and seawalls, boat docks, especially deep boat docks. You'll pull up on a stretch and just see those shad bubbling all throughout, those structures. Bluff Wall is another great place to go find the shad spawn going on, and probably one of the most consistent as well. First hour of the morning, like I said, is critical, and after the sun comes up, it's done. It almost seems like you can't hardly catch a fish that time of year. So I really try to go and look for totally other patterns, just something that's really totally different than that. But if you can capitalize on that first hour, hour and a half, or if it's cloudy, it'll last a little bit longer, but typically not a whole lot longer. It'll be some of the best, fastest, fast-paced fishing that you'll really find. Again, really easy stuff. Swim jigs, great imitator of shad. I want to fish something that kind of looks like the same profile as what they're biting. I want to also fish a bait that I can move pretty quick. I don't slow down at all when I'm throwing, baits for the shad spawn. I'm continuously moving, continuously throwing fast moving baits, trying to trigger these fish. They're in there, they're feeding. There's no need to slow down. It's a very, very quick type of tactic and a quick pattern to exploit. So swim jig's really great. Again, the chatterbait comes back out with that little shad shapeworm trailer. A buzz bait is really good, and then of course a spinner bait. So fast moving stuff, stuff that I can kind of imitate or make look like a shad. And, the whole key is just chunking around some stuff. But if you're seeing those shad and you're seeing them bubbling around, I guarantee you there's some fish close by. One of the cool things, too, on that boat dock pattern, if there's some shad around those boat docks, you can, slow roll a spinner bait or a swim jig or the chatterbait. And I find a lot of times those bass will just hide up underneath, in between the sections of docks, like up under a walkway or in between one of the pontoons, in between the walkways, those bigger giant boathouses, things like that, and they'll hide in there and ambush. So if you can get to where you can make your cast, I'll typically approach it three ways. I'll make a cast down the front of the dock first as I'm approaching it, and if I get bit there, that's great. And then what I want to do is I want to throw down the sides of the dock once I get pretty close to the dock. And the reason I do that is that if there's fish on the outside of the dock, I'm catching those fish first. I'm not going to spook those fish by getting into the front of the dock and casting down the side. So it's just maximizing my area, maximizing my strike zone on those docks, and maximizing the amount of fish that I'm probably going to catch. So if I get lucky and catch a few on the outside edges, then I get my boat in position. I fire a couple of casts down each side of the dock, and then move to the next one. So, 4, 5, 6 casts each place, move to the next one. Same thing with seawalls and things like that is I'm looking for, irregularities in the seawall. Maybe there's a set of steps, maybe there's a turn, whatever the case may be. Just look for something a little bit different. Look for those shad to be bunched up, and those fish will ambush in those spots. So pretty cool little pattern to exploit, but it's an early deal. So, and probably, I don't know what the way the water temperature is going this year and the way this spring is shaping up. We're behind a little bit. Last year at this time, this water was probably already, well in the mid 60s, and now we're struggling to get, to the mid 50s, and we're already at the end of May. So typically the shad spawn is an end of April, beginning of May thing. It may extend a little bit later, this coming season, just depending upon water temperature and what happens and, how things progress the rest of the spring. And then the very last thing is the bluegill spawn, which is a really cool little deal, which happens just about the same time that the shad spawn happens, about 70 degrees in the backs of pockets or backs of coves or in little creeks. A lot of those same places back in those flats, where especially those sandy flats where you saw some of those little drains and stuff like that, great place for, a pile of bluegill beds to appear. And 3 to 5 foot of water typically, and also around some kind of grassy areas. Not necessarily true, for there to be bluegill beds, but certainly helps too. So it's something that I'm looking at. A lot of times they like to build a cluster of beds around some grassy areas, but always doesn't need to be that way either. They'll be out in the open as well. So pretty cool pattern to exploit, and something that not a lot of guys look at either. They'll just go on by because what happens, they're kind of hard to find unless you're specifically looking for them. And if you're focused on something else or another type of pattern, or there's something else that's in your head that you want to go do, you may overlook this unless you physically come upon it or stumble upon it. Because unlike the shad spawn, you can't tell what's going on down here. You physically need to look and find these bluegill beds. And if you see some bluegills around them, I guarantee you there's some bass close by too. So pretty cool pattern to exploit. And this is the time of year when it's topwater time for this to happen. Really good time of year to throw a frog and a walking bait. Those are probably going to be the two baits that I go to first. And the reason for this pattern is really key on being stealth. The shad spawn pattern, I can be pretty aggressive. I can get pretty close to these fish for whatever reason that is. They just don't spook away. Those shad are there. They're not moving. The fish aren't moving too. But the bluegill spawn, for some reason, the much shallower deal, 3 to 5 foot of water, it's typically pretty clear. Bluegills are alerted to your presence. So the further away I can be from those fish, the better off I have to catch that fish off guard. And this is going to be the deal where, unlike the bluegill shad spawn, where there'll be multiple fish on areas, the bluegill spawn, there may be 1 or 2 or 3, but they'll be key fish. They'll be big fish. They may be the biggest ones that have come off a spawn, and they're looking for a big meal. And that's a lot of times why they hover around these bluegill beds, because they know they've got a quick, easy meal. So the further away I can be from the bluegill beds, the better off I can be too. So what I try to do is, when I find these areas, what I'll do is I'll kind of triangulate a spot. And this is kind of old school, how we found things 30 years ago when we didn't have mapping. So say, for example, I find a series of bluegill beds off a point, or maybe out in a flat on a ditch. I'm going to get 3 points of triangulation, whether it's a boat dock or a big tree or a mound or a hill or something like that. Something I can physically look at from a distance and know where that spot is. And then what I may do is try to get a waypoint as close to the series of bluegill beds that I can, and then I'm going to back my boat away. So I kind of have a reference point visually on the land. I have a visual reference point on my map, and then I kind of know where I need to get the boat as far away as possible and launch a big long cast. And that's why I like the walking bait, because I can throw it a long distance and I can get it to work pretty effectively from a long distance away. And that's why I also like the popping frog, because it kind of mimics that bluegill. Both in bluegill colors, you notice, both of them in bluegill colors. And then I can stay as far away from those fish as possible, making that cast and not alerting those fish to my presence, and catch a few more. Because you'll probably only catch, if there's 2 or 3 fish on a particular bluegill bed, you may only catch the first one. Then you'll have to go and find another one and then come back. You can come back if there's more there and catch them, but usually that first fish creates such a commotion that it wrecks the spot for a little bit. You need to come back and fish some more. So a couple little follow-up baits too. I like a chatterbait too, but I may go to a more green pumpkin, and I may change my trailer a little bit too, to a little bit bulkier trailer, a little bit better profile. And this is that Yamamoto Seiko trailer, that kind of a bigger body, more fish-like, tail on it too, which looks a little bit more like a bluegill. Maybe put a green pumpkin on with this color pattern, and fish that. And also a Senko is a great alternative to green pumpkin, or green pumpkin purple green, which looks a lot like a bluegill. Fished wacky style and or dead stick is a great way to catch a few more of those fish, especially if you've already caught a couple. Maybe you've caught a couple on the top water and you've caught a couple on the chatterbait, and there's a few fish around, but they're really spooky at this point. Throwing that Senko out there and kind of dead sticking it is a great way to follow up and catch a few more fish. One of the things that I talk about too is, using your map. And like I said at the beginning too, that there is probably not a better tool that I have to my disposal than having the detail of this, map on my screen. There's no comparison to, fishing without it versus fishing with it. You can tell a whole lot just by looking at this map, and it saves you a ton of time, especially when you get dialed into a pattern and you can immediately zoom your map back out and go find those key areas and pick the areas with the best potential to be able to duplicate your pattern. Because that's all we're really trying to do this time of year is be able to duplicate our patterns. And having that Navionics chip in there is really probably the best tool that I've got for being able to do that, no matter what time of year, but especially in the spring time of year for, exploiting these really obscure type patterns. So we can review. John, I saw some people with some questions pop up too.
Yep, I'll read them off to you when you're ready for them.
Yeah, we're ready.
All right. Let's just see what we've got here. From Big Nasty. It says many boat ramps are off limits during tournaments.
Oh, yeah, and that's a good question. So I'm not talking about public boat ramps. I'm talking about like in somebody's backyard that has a ramp from in their backyard going into the lake. And I'm not sure where he's from, but there's zillions of them down south. I don't think I've ever fished a lake where I haven't found some boat ramps, even up north too. They may not be as prevalent up there, but you can certainly probably find some of that. So I'm not talking about like a public boat ramp where the tournament launches out of, that's off limits for the day. I'm talking about one that's in some dude's backyard.
All righty. Let's see. When fishing squarebill, do you fish the tight wiggle? That's from Chaz.
Yeah, and predominantly most squarebills too, because of their design and shape. That rounded shape gives the squarebill a tight wiggle, and that's a real key. And that's why it's a really good triggering bait for pre-spawn fish when they're cold, and also gives the bait a tremendous amount of deflection quality. And that's the thing that I'm looking for with a squarebill is deflection too. And the difference between a squarebill crankbait and say like a DT6 Rapala is that DT6 is a rounded bill, and it's not going to deflect off a cover as easy as the squarebill does. Squarebill bait will hit the cover and bounce off, a lot of times triggering strikes. And if I'm in a situation where I'm actually having to do that to catch the fish, that's when I'm going to pause my bait too during the retrieve. So I'm going to throw it out, crank it down, let it bounce off the cover, and then stop my retrieve for a quick second. And that's typically when they're going to bite it. Or when I start my retrieve again and that bait's getting away. See, fish have a strike zone. And sometimes that strike zone is very big, and other times that strike zone is very small. Springtime, 50, 52, 54 degree water, that strike zone is going to be fairly small. So especially with a crankbait, the more you can get that bait in front of the fish, the more times they're going to bite it. But yeah, the tight or the kind of wide wobble with a square bill is what I'm looking for with that rounded body.
All righty. This was I'm going to answer this one. It's from Michael. Michael says, "Is platinum Navionics the best one to use?" Of course it is, Michael. Of course it's the best one to use. What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. 1 foot contour detail. You absolutely can't believe the amount of resolution you get with that. It's night and day.
All right, next one. Do you think cement ramps are as good as gravel ramps? That's from John.
Yeah, I like them both. The cement ones, it seems to me that most of the ones that I do find, though, are cement ones. I haven't found too many gravel ones, but the cement ones are really cool because a lot of times they're built on like a gravel foundation, and there'll be a little lip on both sides. And that's a lot of times that is the key spot. So what I'm trying to do when I'm coming up to a ramp is I'll kind of 45-degree angle it, and I'll make a cast to the front side or the side closest to me first. So I may throw to the center of the ramp and bring it across that first lip. And that way, what happens it's the same thing with the boat dock scenario that I talked about. If I caught a fish on the other side of the boat ramp, I got to drag them over the ramp through potential fish that are in front of me, and I don't want to do that. So I want to fish that first edge first, and then go around it, and then maybe throw one straight down, parallel to the other side. But it's a pattern that, I mean, it's no more than 4 or 5 casts, and a lot of times it's a one caster. First cast, you'll catch one, and that's it. And I tend to find too that it's not a type of pattern where they're just going to load up on them and there'll be a ton of fish on them. You may catch 1 or 2 and that's it. But you can keep coming back the next day and the next day and the next day, and they'll always reload. So a pretty cool little pattern to exploit.
All right, this next question is from Brian. Do you tie direct to chatterbait or use a snap? What not to use, and line type?
Yeah, okay. This is best. Shameless plug coming up. This is best. This is best answered by going to my Facebook fishing page, which is Mike Delvisco Fishing. I have tied the same knot now for 30 years. Jimmy Houston showed me this knot 30 years ago. I still tie it, and I tie it for braid. I tie it for monofilament, and I tie it for fluorocarbon. He called it a quick knot. That's what I call it. It's simple, easy to tie. So if you go to Mike Delvisco Fishing, I will, as soon as I'm done with this webinar, I'm going to go ahead and post it. I'll bring it up to the front of the page on my fishing page, and you guys can see it. Extremely easy, but I tie direct to every bait that I'm fishing. I don't use a snap. Now, I will tell you one thing on the chatterbait. It comes with that little snap. And they recently changed that bait this year so that there's a line tie with a post. But yeah, just tied directly to either one of those 2 things. If you've got the older style, tied directly to your snap. If you've got the newer ones with the post, tied directly to the post. But virtually everything else, I'm tying directly to the bait.
All right, the next one is from Bruce. What color blade bait would you use in the Ozarks?
Okay, so I kind of break this down. I the same philosophy with my blade baits as crankbaits. So I have virtually 3 color patterns that I go to most of the time. I have straight silver, which is water that's clear to maybe 1.5 foot visibility. If I get in a situation where the water's got a little bit more green tinge to it, like you get after maybe 4 or 5 days after a rain and the water's starting to get that really nice green color. It's not dirty, but it's not stained. It's kind of in between. I like that gold color. If I get into a situation where I had today, if you notice some of those slides, I actually shot those today, and some of that water was fairly dingy, really, pretty almost brownish or really stained. Then I like the red. Same exact philosophy as I use with crankbaits. And the thing that I'll realize too, and you can apply this to your crankbait fishing, is how do I know I've got the right color? So say you catch a fish on the silver one, but the fish has the back set of hooks in his mouth. A lot of times they're trying to eat it or trying to chase it out of the way, but not quite interested in eating it. at that point, I may want to go and change colors and maybe put the gold one on. And then the next fish I catch, he has the bait swallowed. That's how you know you've got the right color. And it's the same principle as crankbait fishing as I use in that blade bait scenario. Break it down into threes and pick the right color.
All right, this is from Rich. What are your thoughts on Smart Strike maps?
Not sure what that even is. You know, John?
No, I don't. So there's something else out there we both need to learn.
Yeah.
Put some more questions on there. Well, if you can explain it, get it back to us. Yep.
Yeah, I'll do some research.
From John, do you ever use jerk bait as a triggering bait?
Yes, although for these particular patterns, I kind of like the baits that, and it fits more of my style. The baits that I've shown you here in this seminar fits this type of scenario because I'm typically fishing pretty shallow, flat stuff. Although jerk baits are great for triggering fish, and something that shouldn't be overlooked. Like I said in the beginning, there's other baits too that'll work. So, you could certainly apply, fishing a jerk bait to maybe, one of those ditches that's in slightly deeper water, or potentially the boat ramps that maybe out a little bit deeper in that maybe 6 to 8, 10-foot depth range out the end of the boat ramps. Even at the Shad Spawn around some of those docks, a jerk bait is a great bait to catch. The thing about the Shad Spawn though, and a jerk bait is I tend to like to fish single hook baits a lot of times during the Shad Spawn, just because that window of opportunity is really small, and I feel like I can get them off the hook into the live well, or off the hook and back in the water and catch another one quicker on a single hook bait, as opposed to having to mess around with treble hooks. So that's the only reason why I don't fish during the Shad Spawn as much as I do other baits, but certainly something that shouldn't be overlooked.
Mike, just Googled these Smart Strike. It's a feature on the Humminbird, probably on Lake Master. It's a feature on the Lake Master charts.
Okay.
Have you ever used it?
Yeah, I haven't. I fish with Lawrence.
Okay. All right. No worries. This is from Big Nasty again. You mentioned fishing blade baits earlier with the crazy weather nor'easter we've had in the last month here in the Northeast. How long in time duration would you continue to fish that bait in water temps in the mid 40-degree range? And it's only in the 40s here today.
Yeah. It's if there's soft water right now and you're able to get a boat, I know some places up in Maine now it's still they're still socked in with some ice, but other places I'd seen where there's always some free water in Connecticut and Massachusetts, places like that. 40-degree water, that's perfect for throwing that blade bait. It's such a great cold water triggering bait. It may be even better sometimes than a chatterbait, especially up in the Northeast. So I'd be looking at throwing it right now, and maybe not so much back in the flats yet, just because it's a little bit colder and they may not have got there yet. But I probably assume that they haven't, but maybe on some lead in bank. So, just take a little bit of what I've told you and back it up a little bit where, we're a little bit ahead of you guys, water temperature wise, by 10 degrees. So try to fish those lead in banks or transition areas from deep to shallow water before they get into those flats. That's probably where those fish will be. You're trying to intercept them before they get way back, and those are the logical places to go fish. But yeah, I'd be throwing that steel shad blade bait.
All right, we got three more questions. Okay. This one's from Jeremy. Where would you start looking for pre-spawn largemouth on a new lake where it's 49 to 52 degrees and heavily sustained?
Probably exactly what I talked about in this whole seminar. That is perfect water temperature to be looking at some of this stuff. again, depending on what part of the country you're living in, they might not be way back. They're not way back in some of these areas yet where I live, in Tennessee. So I'm kind of looking at both things a little bit of trial and error. If I can, the cool thing about these structures is that they exist both in backwater areas, where these fish will spawn, and also out in main lake areas. So it may be the case where, ditches or little drains or boat ramps or that sort of thing in lead-in areas before you get back into the shallow stuff is going to be where you're going to catch them, and then just follow that progression as it starts to warm up a little bit more, and then you can move back with the fish. But they haven't moved up greatly where I'm at either. So.
All right, this is from Bob. If you're fishing braid with reaction bait, do you use a leader, and if so, how long?
Okay, I do not fish braid with any reaction baits because I like my line to stretch quite a bit. With that being said, if you do tie, because I do fish braid on my spinning reels with like a Ned rig or a grub or just something that I can't throw on a bait cast and, finesse fish and drop shot. I tie either an Alberto knot or one that I just started tying recently called an FG knot. And I'm going to do, if I get some time here tomorrow where it's going to rain all day, I may make a video and put that on my fishing page too, because that one's a whole lot easier for me to tie than the Alberto knot. And the other thing too is that I tie a real long leader. I'll tie maybe 12 or 15 feet of leader. That way, when I have a fish on and I've got them close to the boat, my knot's not exposed either in the guides or out past the rod tip. It's inside the reel. So that FG knot is really, really thin and really protective of the fluorocarbon.
All right, this is from Michael, and then we got one more. It says, I live in Ohio, and my first tournament's in a couple weekends, but our water temps in the low 40s. How deep would you predict the bass will be holding in?
I would probably say, just watch the weather. If you're 2 weeks out, that's about when I start to really pay attention to weather patterns and, how things are going to go. Now, here in Tennessee, it's not a whole lot different weather than, what's up in Ohio right now. Is that we've had a couple of nice days and then a couple of cool downs, a couple of nice days and a cool down. And it's never really got, past 60 degrees yet. So, our fish are still pre-spawn. I would imagine that his fish are probably still the same way, although maybe a week or two behind us. So again, look for those lead-in areas that they're eventually going to spawn in, and apply these tactics if you have that sort of cover available, and look for that. But also watch your weather too, because it's a lot of times it doesn't take a whole lot to get those fish to move, especially this late in the season. These fish are wanting to spawn. They want any small indication to move back and get really aggressive that they can get.
All right. This is from Pat. So you fish the blade bait, both vertical and like a crankbait?
Yes, I don't fish it vertically as much as I rip it. So I'm actually casting it. So I'm making a fairly long cast, and I'm ripping the bait up and letting it fall back down. So my line is actually at an angle. I find that I can cover a lot more water that way and trigger those fish into biting. Now you can absolutely catch them straight up and down like a jig and spoon or a drop shot. If you see the fish on your screen, drop down to them. But this case, I'm trying to cover a lot of water with it, and I find it more highly effective when I'm actually working a long range of water distance, throwing the bait out, rip it, let it fall, rip it, let it fall, rip it, let it fall, and so on until I get the bait back in. That's, to me, the way to trigger fish on this bait.
All right. And they were asking what your website address is.
No, I don't have a website.
Just Facebook?
Yeah, Facebook, Mike Delvisco Fishing.
All right. That's all we have, Mike. I want to, first of all, thank you for doing this tonight. I want to thank Bass Pro Shops. Guys, just to let you know that Navionics does have a special that starts on April 1st through the 30th. $30 off on all Hot Maps Platinum products. Stop by your local Bass Pro Shop, pick one up. Mike's talked about a lot of different lures and rods and line. I know that they have at every one of their stores. I've been in every one of them, I think. Thanks again, Mike, for a great evening. Guys, like Mike said, check him out on Facebook. I have, and it's a good Facebook site. Thanks, Mike, again for tonight. And
Thanks a bunch. And thanks, Navionics Bass Pro Shops. Always fun doing these things. And if you guys have any questions, send me a message. I'll answer everybody.
Thanks again.